it's time that you knew there's someone there who's searching for you, and it's time that you believe he's gonna find you.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the first real episode of Two Guys Fixing the World. My name is Mark Stallard, and the person on the other side of the mic is Ryan Jans. Hey Ryan, how you doing?
Hey, not too bad, Mark. Glad to be here.
Excellent.
I hope everybody had a thrilling. You can all return from the edge of your seats from our thrilling trailer that was posted to YouTube and Facebook and all those other
Periscope
places.
and
not too long
Vaughan
ago.
TV. Yeah. There we go. Yep. So this was actually going to be one of those shows where we're giving ourselves a little bit of leeway, a little bit of freedom. We Ryan and I host a show called The Invisible Man. We also host a
You should
show
tune in with our good buddy Colorado Phil.
Indeed, and we have another show called Musical Mile. One of them is about promoting independent music, and the latter is discussing those difficult questions that we as musicians have. So we're independent musicians, we're also working men, and we are out. We have a rule. I should probably start with that. On those other two shows, that we can't talk about politics and religion unless it directly intersects with the music. But me and Ryan, we like to talk our politics, and so it's kind of a little bit of a bite our tongues sometimes, and so it makes sense that we would progress and do a podcast based on politics. And this isn't necessarily, we're not necessarily standing on our soapbox to convert you to our particular weird way. Part of this, well, maybe part of that, but part of what we're doing, a big part of it, is we're actually exploring this, some of it for the first time as well. And we're going to try and examine many different aspects of politics through the lens of the working people, as we are.
Yeah, that's for sure. Certainly, and when we say working people, both Mark and I are professionals. We both work for companies as day jobs. We're still passionate about music, want to make music, and actually just content creators ourselves. But right now, that is not a feasible source of income for us. So like, share, subscribe, and maybe a Patreon will come out, and then we could move away from having to be working men and do something that we enjoy. Yeah. But that is the plight of a lot of content and creative people. We unfortunately have to pick up day jobs, and that gets covered a lot in our musical mire. So you can tune into that. That usually goes every couple of weeks. There will be a heads up when the next one comes out. And so we just jump right into it now?
Almost. We're just theinvisibleman.ca for The Invisible Man Show and Musical Mire. And for more information about this show and other shows as they come up, check out fixingtheworld.ca. That's going to be that is the main website for this show. And of course, we'll be on, if we're not already, on all the major podcast providers, sites, whatever you kids call it these days. We're going to be on there. So today we're going to be talking about minority governments, and Ryan's going to kind of take over a bit, but there's something we haven't told you guys. It's now October the 21st. It is election day. The polls are about to close in about 7 minutes here in Manitoba. Ryan, where do we stand?
As of now, our political standings, hang on, I'm just refreshing my browser to see so if you've been paying attention at all to any of they're predicting a minority government. They're not saying who, but I've just refreshed my browser, and currently the Liberals are winning at 32%, followed closely by the Conservatives at 31.6%. The NDP have 18.4%. The Greens 7.5%. Bloc Québécois 7.0%. The PPC at 2.5%, and all the others are at 0.9%, 1%.
Cool.
So, and other would include everything from the Communist Party, the Christian Heritage Party, to probably a few independents as well. All that is great in the wonderful democratic system that we
Yeah.
have.
And actually, so we
um,
thought this would be good. We're doing it live. It was probably as much coincidence as anything that we started this show on election day, but kind of fitting. But it was. I thought it would be good that as we're actually going through it while we're recording this, this won't happen probably very often at all. But it fits in very nicely with the topic that we had planned to talk about.
Yeah, that's great. So a lot of what we're going to be covering over is I found in a couple articles of based on cbc.ca. We will include links at fixingtheworld.ca. All our reference material, we'll always share that with you, give you as much as there. And as always, we welcome your comments. Can't promise you that I may want to respond to any of them, or you may not like my responses, but we'll deal with that.
Let's promise we'll promise we'll try.
Yeah, we'll try. We'll try our best, and we'll try and do it in the most respectful way possible. You are allowed to have your opinion, and it can differ from ours. That's perfectly fine. That's the wonderful country we live in. Anyways, so as we were starting off, we are predicting. There's predicting a minority government, and the numbers would seem to say, hey, these are pretty close numbers. So don't think we're going to come out with a clear majority here. So what is a minority government, and what is and how does that actually work? So the Canada's electoral process in a nutshell is there are 338 seats in the House of Commons. That's where your MPs go. And in theory, the most amount of people, so if you get 170 or 171 seats, you get to form a majority government, and you have the most amount of votes. However, in situations that are going to occur much like tonight, you will probably have parties that have 140 seats, 135 seats, maybe 90 seats. And I'm sure that math is wrong, and someone will correct me in the comments. But the point is that you won't have all the seats will be filled, all 338 seats will be filled, but you won't have a clear victor or a clear majority. Now, one leader, but you can't guess who, has decided that is a subversion of the democratic process. It's actually just a mechanism to make sure that our democratic process goes in. We have that so that we actually don't spend forever and ever trying to elect just a majority. One of the things we're going to talk about, well, actually, I'll outline a couple of things that we're going to talk about. So we've sort of breezed over what minority governments are versus a majority government. And we're going to talk about some of the really good things about a minority government. We're going to talk about some of the really bad things about a minority government. And then we're going to do some comparisons. Prior to us actually recording this, Mark and I were discussing, and one of the things that we will actually dig into a little deeper is how closely does a minority government actually mimic a proportional representation type of government. Now, we'll probably just talk about it and throw some opinions around, but to be brought up on a later show, we'll get into that one a little bit deeper, probably when we talk more about proportional representation, so we can do a little bit more research on that. So, Mark, what are your thoughts on minority governments?
Well, I mean, I think the minorities don't tend to get a lot of stuff done. It makes, and you can even see historically, you can see that some parties will actually vote for policies that are detrimental to their own existence, for the reason why they exist, just in order to get a few wins. But they have to compromise. That's the whole point. You give me something, I'll give you. I think the funny thing was, and I wanted to kind of get this little anecdote out early, was before I really got into politics, I was, probably in 10, 11, 12, something along those lines. And there was lots of talk about the political pendulum. And, sometimes the Labour was in, I think, and I just happen to know that. Don't know if I was aware of it at the time, but Conservatives were likely to get in, and everyone's arguing with each other. And I just said to my dad, why do we have to have parties? Why don't we just everybody get together and you can make you can then pass laws that way? And my dad actually laughed quite loudly, as I can see now the naivety of that statement. Is that in that regard, you would have you wouldn't necessarily have anybody in control, and you would have to do a lot of compromising. Now we should be able to compromise. We should be able to compromise for everybody's benefit, but we're not going to, because we've got some of those parties exist, not for the benefit of most people. Anyhow, yeah.
They're just there for their own agenda. We're not going to compromise on our point. And that comes off heroic in some cases, but I think it actually is detrimental. One of the greatest things, I grew up in a very conservative home. I'm not conservative bashing. There are decent conservative ministers. There's decent conservative people who are out there. What I'm saying is it's not wrong. We're not telling you that it's wrong to be conservative, but what we are saying is that some of their policies are a little questionable, and a lot of things do tend to come out saying, "Oh, well, the conservatives are the right, the moral party," where they're about this. It's like, yeah, but you got to balance morality out some other way. So you're saying you're not moral because you're comparing yourself to. If you have to compare yourself to, say, like Hitler or something that is obviously evil, to say that you're moral, well, I think you need to look at yourself a little deeper in the mirror and realize that there are so many subtle things, and we're all susceptible to doing the most awful things. But where I was going with this is one statement that had really stuck with me, coming from that conservative background. I had worked for a lot of small business. I had worked for a lot of medium business that typically most conservative people would go after. One of the things that had come up during the Harper administration, when they actually had a government, two consecutive conservative minorities, is that they're saying, well, we can't get anything done. We can't pass law. And a statement that had come up, because I had recently been looking at other political thoughts just for interest and making sure that I have as balanced an opinion as I like to think that I had, is a statement that came out that said, if somebody says there ought to be a law, there probably ought not. Now, that's not the case in every situation, but it does bear the question of, why are we doing this? Why are we passing a law that could potentially be detrimental to some and only benefit a few, right? And you're probably going to hate me by the time you stop listening to this podcast, because I'm going to throw an adage out there that's right out of Friedrich Nietzsche's book of philosophy. Is, if you say something, why do you say that? So I'm going to say, I picked on the conservatives. Now I'm going to pick on the NDP. Well, we need to have affordable housing, so that everybody in Canada can have affordable housing. Well, are you saying you actually want that for people, or are you saying that because you want to get back at or try and hinder the real estate sector for whatever reason, or it interferes with something else there? The point is just to ask why. Why is it? What is the internal motivation of this? And that was quite the rabbit trail to go down. But that's kind of my viewpoint on what caused me to change, and why I actually thought minorities were good, because in fact, during those Harper minorities, I still considered myself to be conservative. It wasn't until he won his majority in the next sequence that I lost all faith in the Conservative Party. So, and that's another story for another day. So,
for sure. Yeah, it's I mean, one of the first things that came to mind when I saw that article from that, for sure, that was actually it's on CBC. You can look this one up, actually. What happens if no one wins? Nope. Sorry, that's not. No, the party, still CBC. No, the party with the most seats don't always govern. And my knee-jerk reaction was, well, the truth of the matter is, at least high level, we don't get to pick our prime ministers, just like they don't in England. Here, the Governor General picks the prime minister. It just happens to be that the prime minister is the leader of the party that forms the government, or that's selected to form the government, which is not the same thing as having the most votes.
Correct.
Yeah. So as far as yeah, I think I've probably said enough about compromise, which I was going to go down that road. But there's this naivety that we have this wonderful system. We have a real democracy when, in fact, when we're stuck in these positions where you can choose between maybe two. We've got a third party, but it's generally very weak. You got to pick between one of the two, and people do a little bit of flip flopping. And then you all, obviously, we can see just the history of the Canadian elections that we've had so many minority governments, and how expensive would that be to keep doing that? But it shows that no one's really got the thumb on the pulse of the nation. Don't really know what people want, what people need. It's a symptom, or it's a symptom of a system that's not really offering anybody anything.
Yeah, and so just for everyone else's education, there are several mechanisms that can be worked out for a minority government. There can be a coalition, which is when we talk about compromise. Two or more parties can join together and elect sort of a leader between them. Then there is a confidence and supply agreement. Under a less formal arrangement, a party with fewer seats would agree to support a minority government in exchange for an agreed list of priorities or policies. So basically, hey, Liberals, you got in. We're the NDP. We're going to go with you, but we want to make at least 3 policies based on these criteria. And a case by case, which is the route that both Paul Martin of the Liberals and Stephen Harper took in the most recent examples of federal minority governments. There have been 13 minority governments in Canada's history. 13 minorities, just in case, for those of you who want to be on Jeopardy. Stephen Harper took the most recent examples of federal minority governments. They simply worked together with the parties to get the support that they needed as they wanted, on a case-by-case vote. So they basically have put everything down to a confidence vote or a free vote in the House. They're not going to vote as parties because they know they're not going to get the support, so they put it up to a free. That actually produced some of the best legislation that the Conservative Party, in my opinion, ever put forth, and then they had to ruin it all by getting a majority the next go around, and then they had Mike Duffy. So again, another political episode.
So now,
on the Senate.
Now, in your opinion, not necessarily having to go into the details of what that legislation was, but do you think that was because the party with the fewer votes that they had the coalition with had power over them enough to get the more, I would say, the more decent legislation through? Obviously, when someone has full power, they can do what they want and don't have to worry about the opposition.
So
what do you think happened in that case?
That's a really good question. The specific one that I think of, and I can't remember if it was in their first or in their second term when they dropped the GST. I think most political parties realize that, hey, they're planning on dropping the GST. If we support that, that makes us look good. So the last thing you want to do is topple a government, say how bad they are, and then say, hey, by the way, we voted to keep your taxes high. That really isn't that's not a good way to win constituents. But for the most part, I think it was. I think, and I'm trying to remember. This is going back to like 2009. So there's a lot of things. Like it's hard to separate all these. Like we had mentioned before, politics touches every part of our lives.
Yep.
This is going back in around 2008, 2009. This is in the middle of a crisis, a world financial crisis. Greece has gone bankrupt. The U.S. housing bubble scam broke.
2008.
Canada has a minority government, and me as a young working Canadian who had been trying to save early for my retirement, watched my retirement portfolio go from about, that had grown over a couple of years from like 3,600 with minimum contributions and a good upfront to like less than what I had put in the first place, right? So now we're all disillusioned and so upset about the things that were happening, angry at our leaders, and then at the same time, you're looking at parties that were threatening just to overthrow the government that didn't have much better plans to begin with, right? You'd hear from then opposition leader Justin Trudeau saying, "Oh, we're going to form a coalition with the NDP, with the he's no longer with us, Jack
Leighton.
Layton."
Dear old Jack. He would have made a great prime minister.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of people recognized him as a genuine person, but they were constantly trying to just their point was, it was like, yeah, we're going to overthrow the government because they're doing such bad things. Okay, what's your plan? We're going to do everything the Conservatives are going to do. Well, just work with them then. No, but we want to do it. No, well, so, and that's where there's suddenly Harper got his very commanding majority because they got sick of people bickering and back and forth and threatening elections. Because let's face it, I voted in the pre-election for one reason. I don't want to stand in line after work to run, have to run after work to come here and, have someone look after my kid or try and keep a toddler entertained in a gymnasium of a school just so I can go, write down on a ballot. Yep. I find that extremely intrusive and difficult. It's important, but I pre-vote as often as I possibly can whenever I'm able, right? So it's very important. Minority governments always have that threat, that looming threat. If we don't get along, we're going back to the polls, and polls are costly, regardless of what an administration might do during its time in office. Polls are costly. It costs money to do elections, right? So,
whoops.
Alrighty.
There we go.
Technical difficulties with the mic?
Yes, a little bit there. Just had to turn that light off. It was in my eyes.
No problem.
And it was probably ruining the picture as well. Yeah, joke. Funny. Right, where were we?
Basically had talked about how
Right.
Minority governments have that threat looming over them at all times, that we could potentially be going back to the polls.
Yeah.
According to that one article, what happens if no one wins a majority? The average, hang on, I just had it right here. Where is it? With some exceptions, they typically lasted less than 2 years. The 1979 Conservative minority government only lasted 6 months before they were defeated. So it can very easily go the other way. 2 years seems to be about right. It's sort of about half of what your normal 4-year or 5-year term, 4.5 or 5-year term would go, and that seems to track that.
Yeah. Oh, no, there comes a point. Yeah, I mean, I can see why. Once the smaller partner, the one with the fewer seats, have got all they need, then there's very little for them to back the other party for, right? Once they've got what they want. And we're looking at,
again, depending on what style of minority government you've gone through, right? So
and if you've got to that point where you're in your second term with the minority, surely that first term they must have got almost all of it. It's like, what else can the other can they hold over the one with the most power? So it's makes a lot of sense that they would be unstable.
Mm-hmm.
Got any thoughts there on what the other what the different kinds of minority governments are?
So typically, the minority government. So we kind of have been talking about the very unstable, and that's sort of very reminiscent of what would be considered the hang on here the case by case. That's
Yeah,
similar to what Paul Martin and what Stephen Harper did during their administrations, because that is the biggest risk, but it also brings the potentially the biggest yield. You
right,
could get a bill passed very quickly if you were willing to compromise enough. Um, However, the double side to that is um, you probably are looking at something that is just as volatile as successful, right? It's that whole notion of like when you invest, if you invest in
yeah,
risk,
yeah,
if you invest in a risky stock, your potential payout is huge, but you also carry the risk, right? You potentially could lose.
yeah,
Very difficult. So that's the case by case, and that's I don't know how many have actually gone that route. The confidence and supply agreement would be more like, okay, if the Liberals win this go around and they make a decision to work very closely with the NDP, which actually doesn't seem too much of an unlikely scenario. You would see, hey, Jagmeet Singh might say, hey, we'll support you, we'll vote for everything that you do, but we want you to make policies based on the following criteria. When
right,
A, B, C, D meet those, that seems like it'd be much more stable. You're more likely to get 2 or 3 years out of that as opposed to um, risking whether or not they just would go. And then a full on coalition would be in like almost like a merger of the two parties, right? You'd have the Liberals and the there. You'd say Jagmeet Singh would say, okay, Trudeau can be prime minister. I'm going to be this critic or this minister, right? And the critic would be on the other side of the room. So, and then they would have to try and get along as one party as opposed to there, which also seems equally as unstable. Probably the best one would be to do the case by case or sorry, the confidence and supply agreement where you just agree to make policies on
yeah,
behalf of so you're guaranteed their votes.
yeah. Well, I'm glad you stopped yourself there because the case by case would seem to be the most unstable.
Yes, that by far is the most stable, the most
I'm,
unstable.
and if we go back to my anecdote, that's probably kind of what I was thinking as a small boy there when I was questioning why we do it this way. This is silly. But yes, now I see the error of my ways. Um, yeah. So yes. So what are the odds? What are we looking at now with the statistics there with the polls as well?
I just refreshed it. Actually, it just came up.
Yep.
Nothing has changed in the time that we've been talking.
Okay.
Still 32% Liberal, 31.6 for the Conservatives. So that's a very tight race. 18.4 for the NDP, 7.5 for the Greens. The Bloc is coming in at 7.0.
Well, I guess most of the polls are closed now, right? So it's
Yeah.
10 to 9 p.m. So Manitoba's closed, and I imagine
Yep.
that Saskatoon must be already. I think they're the same time as us. So just a handful of there's a couple of provinces.
We're on the
out
same
west.
time as them now, I think, aren't they?
I think
Or are we
so.
ahead?
Yeah, close. One of those. Yeah, they don't change what we do. Yeah.
We
Okay.
don't believe in time zones here on Two Men Fix the World. That's one thing we
Oh,
will.
yeah. I've got a history of completely screwing those up for other shows that we've been on.
So
Yeah.
now we've kind of talked about the pitfalls and the undesirables. What actually? Why would you want a minority government? In fact, for the last few government, the elections, the last two majority governments, I've very happily said I would have been happy with minority governments. Now, I tend to be a little bit more politically centrist. I tend to like the idea of mixing of political ideals because I do think it makes the best kind of legislation that is out there. So that is obviously one point. But Mark? What do you think are some of the strengths of a minority government?
Well, yeah, I think that I think we've already touched on that, right? Is that you get the people or the parties that don't necessarily have as much power. We'll pick on the NDP in Canada because I don't believe NDP has ever had ever formed a government in Canada. I think.
They have not. They came close
Yeah.
last time around when
Yeah.
Jack Layton was terminally sick. So a lot of sympathy vote.
Yeah.
Probably not a lot of idealistic vote, but
Yeah.
a lot of
So
sympathy vote.
yeah. So I mean, so one of the pros would be that some of the legislation from the other parties could at least get a reading, at least could at least be brought forward, which maybe wouldn't have otherwise.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's kind of got to be good. Yeah, I don't really want to go on to the cons yet, but I'll say that's also a con as well, as where you've got someone holding holding the party with the most seats at ransom, right? Because the whole idea of a minority government is so that they don't lose a vote. Because if they do, that puts the government's existence in question.
In question, yeah.
Yeah.
Their ability to govern. Now that dates all the way back to the French Revolution, because our system is based on the English system or the British system, which you're very familiar with, and that is basically based off the French Revolution, I believe. Correct?
Yeah. I'm not sure.
I think
there's a big
it's the
tie-in with.
closest system that I can sort of through some of the historical research that I did. A lot of it is just looking at a lot of YouTube videos around the turn of the century for French, because Parlement is a French word, right? So
Yeah.
it means to talk.
Well, let's not forget that William the Conqueror and probably an entire many generations of British monarchs were bloody French, weren't they? Oh, sorry, excuse me the language there.
How do you really feel about that, Mark?
How do I feel about the French? Love the French. Just not keen on one particular family controlling the British Isles. So yeah, there are a lot of French words, and I don't think it has anything to necessarily to do with the revolution. I think the English system is based on the separation on there's a couple of civil wars, and you had the landowners in the one house who are the commoners, not to be confused with the just the regular people. There would have been villeins, the serfs, even though feudalism was kind of breaking apart then. And the other house are the household lords, the ones that owned, but that was in control of it all. And so the landowners would have been they would have been holding the land for the lords. So they split those up to commoners and the lords. That's why we have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the irony, I guess, there is that we would consider ourselves commoners, but we would have been far less back in those days, back in the 1600s.
Yeah, well,
so we were
I
less than
think
because we wouldn't have had a votes.
In the 1600s, I'd have been an old man. At
Yeah,
37 years old, I would have been an old man.
But
And you would have been even older.
No, I would have been revered. Yeah, so we can probably go into a little bit more on that, and definitely I would love to do a bit more reading and to look at that a little bit more as well.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's any
Future topic for
But
another
that-
show.
but there are definite parallels with the because it was basically the same people that were sitting on the left and the right of the king, right? So the right were the royalists, and the left side of them were pretty much the landowners, the people that controlled, that were controlling the land. So it's very, very similar, probably for similar economic reasons that they're there. Which is, by the way, where we got our terms, the left wing and the right wing. Anyhow, that's a little bit of being a bit of a Cliff Clavin there on that one. There you go.
That's all good, man. Just give me a chance to get organized with my notes here.
Indeed.
But it's great. That is a great point, and it is helpful to understand the right and the left side right and left, and then during the Cold War, post World War II, especially post World War II American, right and left became very synonymous about socialistic versus capitalistic, and which eventually morphed into what we have, the various forms of socialism, all the way up to communism, all the way over to pure unadulterated capitalism, and everything in between. And so typically
And just
right equals
and I just want to clarify something for just for the listeners. There is that we're picking on capitalism. Not that we're revolutionists or anything. Maybe we are, maybe we're not. It's just that is that on the one side we've got socialism that we are defining it as egalitarian. We're all equals. We're all pulling our own weight and all playing part in the society. Whereas capitalist is authoritarian, almost exclusively authoritarian. So that's the difference. That's where we're kind of coming from, or authoritarian versus egalitarian. Sorry, Karen.
That's right. No, and I was actually about to get to that point. I'm glad you brought it up, and it's probably a good idea for us to switch that up. Basically, when you look at it now at the States and even here in Canada, we're starting to get a little bit more extreme in our politics. So that means we're getting a little bit more extreme in how they get done. You could have an authoritative liberal government or an authoritarian liberal government. You could have an authoritarian NDP government, even though they tend to stand up for socialistic means. It's how they govern is what is going to determine whether they are right versus left on our side. So that's why I say we're not going to promote a single party. We're going to pick them out evil, equally.
Freudian slip there, yeah.
We're gonna pick them apart equally. We're gonna pat them on the back when they've done right. We're gonna criticize them when they've done wrong, right? But you could. It just happens to be that it seems that anything that is on the conservative side of the spectrum almost automatically lends itself to that, because they do sort of base themselves on that 9-to-5 corporate lifestyle, which is very authoritarian. So that's where. And there's a whole thing that we could get into on how the school system was changed based on business influence, how you could talk about the like grading, grade A, B, C, D, standardized systems, so that, classes at 10 and goes from 10 to 10:45, you get a 15-minute break, and then you get 11 till 12, and then you get an hour lunch, and then blah, 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 blah. It all mimics the 9-to-5 American workday that was consistent of factory work in the turn of the century, is when you start to see those kind of swings. So that's again another topic for another show.
I did not know that. So yeah, I learned something.
Yeah, no, it actually, if you look at the school system, it mimics it. Now we've probably moved away from it, and it's probably more allegorical now. But because I don't know anybody who goes to work at 8 and gets home at 3 who isn't a CEO. Yeah. But
They wouldn't work that long.
Okay, it's to work at 8, disappears around 12, and gets home at 3. Yeah. Okay, that's probably more accurate to a high-paid CEO. But again, I don't know many high-paid CEOs.
Yeah, me either. But let's assume the worst.
The stereotypical high-paid CEO. But yeah, it actually the school system does very closely mimic. And like I said, now it's probably more allegorical than anything. But when you looked at how things were taught, particularly post economic, the Industrial Revolution, you go from a small 20-person village where you have 1, maybe 2 teachers. It's most likely so post-industrial revolution, you move to something similar to what we have, conditioning people to be part of the American workforce, versus prior to that, where you'd have like 1 or 2 nuns or 1 or 2 school teachers that would be teaching an entire village. The class would be integrated. You'd have multiple ages overlapping, and that's how that it was done. And we wouldn't have necessarily a grading system that's A to B to C. The letter grade was synonymous with courses. So you think of like grade A, B as top of the line, whereas there's grade B, grade C, all that stuff, and it goes all the way down. And that's your lettering system for your grading. And the highest get the best jobs, and so on and so forth. That's how that ranking system goes.
Interesting.
So
right, we're off. As not really unexpected, we're a bit off topic. That's probably not going to happen again. I suspect it will. But yeah, just to get back a little bit there, we can maybe just talk a little bit about proportional representation. I think the question you had, whether it was on while we were recording or not, was would minority governments would that produce similar results to proportional representation? So, do you have any thoughts on that one?
My because we don't live in a country that has proportional. Let's try that again. Proportional representation. We because we don't live in it's hard to comment, and everything is just all speculation. But proportional representation would mean that you're actually increasing the amount of ministers or people or critics or just members of your parliament. So it would probably lend itself to getting more minority type scenarios. So I would have to say yes. Again, if I'm going to bring it back to my own riding, and it's often, like I said, split pretty equally between the main three parties in Canada, between the Liberals, the NDP, and the Conservatives. That means we'd be sending potentially 3 MPs from one location, based on the population. Could be anywhere from 2 to 3, depending on how the proportional representation is calculated, right? Yeah. But assuming it's a worst case scenario, that'd be 3. So in your neighborhood, I'm betting it's a pretty close run between. I think city center always is reliably liberal. I think, right?
It was. I'm not sure historically, but we had we have Conservative. That was ousted by Jim Carr, who's Liberal, and I'm not sure the history of that. Before that, I didn't live in this area. I actually lived in your area. I lived in Elmwood before that.
Yeah,
so, so
go Elmwood. My initial thought is that it was pretty close. You're pretty close to saying Liberals are. It's probably safe Liberal territory, the city center.
Yeah.
Well, except with the exceptions, there's always exceptions, right? A lot of times,
you can't get. There are no guarantees in politics. You ask the Americans in the last general. There was a dead cert who was going to win and who really did. But we're looking at proportional representation. We have some systems, and we're going to we'll do an entire show on this because I know a little bit about it, and I'd love to know some more. So. But if we look at the statistics or the percentage on the polling that you gave us throughout the show here, so Liberals are at 32%, Conservatives are at 31%, NDP 18.4%, Greens 7.5%, and the Bloc 7.0%. Now I know the provincial Green Party of Manitoba was. I know what their system is. Well, we can go into that a little. In detail in the proportional representation show, but based on their system, that 7.5 would have guaranteed them 1 and possibly 2 seats this time round, if this was spread, and the same with Bloc Québécois. They also would have been very, very close to having a seat, and then then it would have been proportional based on based on the number of votes. So if you win your riding, or the green ones is if you win your riding outright, then you've got it. If you don't get enough, and then they do a little calculation, and whoever gets the most of the votes, there are 2 or 3 seats left over that they would then apportion out. It's a little bit of an odd one, but it ends up with very similar results to other proportional representation models. But that's the difference here, though. And the point really was that if you had a minority government, odds are it'll be Liberals with the NDP. It's not the odds, right. or Liberals with the Green. Certainly, this is what happened in the BC, right? Was it
and it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to. It could be the Liberals, the Green, and the NDP. It could be 3. A coalition,
but it's not going to be all of them. That's the point.
That's right.
Right, so it's not going to be all of them. And so it can't be the same as proportional representation because it's only going to be those ones that agree. And if if we look at the Liberals, well, if we look at the Conservatives and the NDP joining together, which is almost impossible. I can't imagine that, but wait till tomorrow morning. It probably already has. But if the NDP and the Conservatives got together, then you almost forgot my point there. But if the two lowest got together, then you would have. Actually, I'll just do the math here. Yeah, actually, they could probably team up with everybody else, right? But it's only going to be those two that's only those two that are going to have a say in what legislation comes forward. For the most part, I know we're not the US. You can't block legislation. The Speaker will do that. But then you're going to have a third of the people who got most of the votes are just not going to have a say, right? It's it's kind of, but it's always going to be the two, or it could be, it could be the Liberals with the Bloc and Greens, but it can never ever be all of them. Otherwise, actually, what was that? The remember what the name of that one was? It was the case by case. Is really what you've got there, right? Anyhow, so is proportional representation better when we go now? What would it be? Yeah, probably, but there are problems with proportional representation, and it's not necessarily with the proportional representation, rather other things. But I'm not going to say what that is until we talk about that particular part.
Till that
teaser
topic.
So
and we may even have to compare it to, say, something like a ranked ballot, which is another chance to do proportional representation. That one we'll have to definitely look into.
So we can pick the. We can pick. I think maybe we should just pick 2, 3 ones that are actually being used around the world, and look at those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I guess my original thing is with proportional representation. Is that going to lead? We're basically increasing the number of people who are going to sit in your house, right?
Yep.
That just has to go up,
yep.
Right? There's just no way around it. So now all of a sudden, I don't know what the math would be. I'm just going to make up some numbers. Now we've gone from 338 seats to 520, whatever. It's probably more. It could be less than that. So that means we now have a bunch more voices talking, which means it's going to be that much more difficult to potentially or that much more easier to reach a stalemate. That's the real concern with proportional representation for me. And it gets to be that point where you have to be very good and you have to be able to understand and compromise and write legislation that forces. And so on one side, it's difficult to legislate. On the other, it applies that sort of razor. Why are we actually writing this bill? If I'm proportionally represented, I have more people who might say no to that. But with the idea of a minority government, if I have to appease a case by case, or if I have to appease some of the others, what was it? The scenario that I had here. The agreement where I agree to make 3 of your policies. Well, if I pass this law, confidence and supply agreement, if I pass this law that doesn't benefit my constituents, but just benefits, say, a rich contributor to my party, I might lose their confidence, right? They're not gonna vote with me on things that I want, because I've done something that actually countermands them. They could say, "Hey, we want longer. We want guaranteed 3 weeks of vacation for every single person who works," and then they're going to sign a bill that gives corporations the ability to choose or rank based on seniority, to assign vacations based on that, right? Yeah. So you could run into conflicts that way, and
right.
so my.
So I was just kind of just look at that. Yes, if we were to do proportional representation, and it would require more seats. However, would it mean more parties? Because if you've got, let's not forget the way the political party system works is that if you don't toe the party line, you don't stay in the party very long. So if you're arguing with fellow people in your party, you're probably going to be an independent very soon, right?
Yep.
So unless unless we get more political parties or we have an influx of independents, I find the gridlock probably is not going to happen. But if we have more representation, doesn't mean we get more that are that what we want and what we need, what's good for us, is going to happen. If we're just going to get what the party wants us to have anyway, we've got to, going back to what I said at the beginning about your cable package. Yeah, you can end up with a whole load of stuff that you don't even know you wanted, but they tell you do, right?
Now the question is, and this is something that maybe we pose this as a challenge to our listeners or something. What would you rather have? Would you rather have a government that has the ability to pass capricious law, easily, or would you rather pay for a government, because it's all funded by our taxes, right? So would you rather pay for a government that's deadlocked and actually hammered out a bill that made the most sense, or eventually just dropped it because they couldn't reach an agreement and probably would avoid changing things like labor reforms or labor laws or criminal codes, or something that doesn't need immediate redress? What would you rather have? I know which one I would rather have. I'd rather have them grind it to a halt and really think about what they're doing before they just rubber stamp something, right? That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, there needs
What
to be.
would you think about that?
Well, absolutely. I think I probably do. I would rather have that. I certainly looking at the almost absolute power that the Conservative Party under Pallister's had here in Manitoba these last 4 years now, and they've got again. They can do something stupid like, let's name a day after the anti-red tape day. I forget what they called it. It's a ridiculous law. It's insane, and it's a lie because they're not opposed to red tape, which is just bureaucracy slowing everything down. They want to get rid of regulations on businesses and corporations, and we're going to talk about that. So definitely going to be talking that one in another show. But yeah, we got that they got rid of the what was it? The Life-Saving Acts, the Life-Saving Drugs Bill. It was called the Life-Saving Drugs Bill. It got renamed to I forget what it was. It was the Important Drugs Bill. That's what it's called. I can't remember. And then the NDP got in for 17 years, left it alone, and then Pallister got in as a consultant. They finished the job and got rid of it because they couldn't get rid of a life-saving drugs bill, right? So yeah, there are some really kind of crazy things that you can do if no one's there to stop you or no one's there to make you think.
Yeah. Now the other side of the coin is you can over-regulate too. Being the cunning centrist that I am.
Right, and we've got to talk about what regulation means, right? We need that definition.
Right,
now,
and I actually work in an industry that's regulated. It's okay, so this is probably a little bit more of an adult show. It's regulated up the ass, right up to the kind of screws I can use. Right now, is that necessary to regulate that deep? Well, I'm in the fire and life safety business. You can't really put a cost of regulation on somebody's life, right? But on the flip side, as long as it meets, electrical code and standards, because we're a subset of the electrical trade, why does it matter what kind of screw I use? As long as it's fit to be used in the electrical trade, why do you care? Why does it have to be Candy Wilson?
That would definitely be worth talking about there. I mean, there might be.
Exactly. So
that could have well have been Mr. Phillips. May have been may have slipped us the MPs a couple of nickels or something just to put that legislation through, so people bought his screws, right? Quite possible.
Yeah, that's entirely possible.
Anyhow, so we can talk into that. I think we'll talk to that, I'm sure, lots and lots over the coming weeks. Okay, I think we've been going over an hour.
Yeah.
So
we'll bring it into land and say, like, there's a lot of downplay on the chance there's minority. There's rhetoric from political leaders saying that, you know, it's subversive of the democratic process. It's part of the democratic process, man. I know Andrew Scheer's never going to listen to this, but if you ever did, buddy, listen, you were in the Governor General's office. You know how this works. It's not a subversion of Canadian politics. Yes, the one who wins the most seats, if you get 171 seats, you win. Okay, you win a majority. If you get 140, you don't win, and they don't, and everybody else gets the remainder. You don't win. That's just the mechanism, how it works. You know the rules,
Yep.
play by them. So, with that being said, and that's a scare tactic. Oh, they'll never get anything done. Well, should they really get certain things done? Right?
Yep.
Some things ought not be touched. Right? And minority governments are a good way to sort of sidestep that. And I think all us Manitobans and even the people with us nationally have seen every government that's had a majority rubber stamp a law that really shouldn't go into effect. And they pass it on, and that's where minorities are a great way to balance that out. So that's the biggest pro. The con is that they do tend to grind to a halt, and it feels like nothing is getting done.
Right.
So that's our show for that. We're gonna wrap it up.
So
Again, all links to the articles will be on fixingtheworld.ca. Come check it out. Like, subscribe on Facebook and all those things.
YouTube,
Mark, are you
Periscope. Oh, actually,
Yeah,
maybe
YouTube.
maybe not Periscope. Anyhow, yeah. So we'll be available on all the podcast platforms. We'll have a list for those on the website as well shortly, as well as we'll be repeating that. So we're putting that in the show notes wherever we post this as well on top of that. So we haven't decided on what the topic is going to be next week, but you can be sure we've got a lot of things to talk about, and it's going to be just as
Come up with even more.
and we're going to become just as excited about those as well. So thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and we'll catch you all next week.
He's gonna find you